My main thing for our American audience is to say, listen, these guys in Washington are leading us down a path toward World War III over something that is absolutely unrelated to our national interest. But this one, I mean, it has all the hallmarks, and I didn't see the details, but our election has all the hallmarks of one of the dirtiest elections you can ever imagine. Look at all the attorneys general elections across the country. When you have someone like George Soros funding all of these crazed lunatics who get into office and let all the rapists out, and oh my gosh,
Yes.
he murdered a few people again. Who would have thought that would have happened? I mean, we've got a serious problem in the country. In the absence of Trump, they have now transferred all that hatred of Trump toward Putin. And so they
Hmm.
actually believe that by attacking Putin, they're avenging this 4-year nightmare of Trump.
Welcome to the State of Affairs in partnership with Serbian Radio Chicago. We are having conversations that matter, and I am pleased to welcome Mr. Daniel McAdams today. He serves as the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. He is also a co-host and co-producer of Ron Paul Liberty Report, and he served as a foreign policy advisor to then Congressman Ron Paul. Mr. McAdams, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, I've been meaning to reach out. I think there's a lot to unpack, particularly in this foreign policy arena. And I have to, on a side note, tell you that some of us who are of a younger generation growing up during Congressman Paul's term, he was the inspiration for many of us to actually enter the political arena when we were in our early 20s. And of course, that is also thanks to you for giving him very sensible advice, particularly on foreign policy.
Oh, thank you very much.
So let's look into what the current affairs are, and let's talk about this conflict in Ukraine. What is actually going on in Ukraine?
Well, the war did not start on February 24th. The war started in February of 2014. I'm sure all your listeners understand what that means. And in fact, you could date it back to 2005 when the U.S. became involved in the Orange Revolution to overthrow Yanukovych. That time, they helped overthrow him twice.
Sure.
The Ukrainian voters go to vote, and they vote for a candidate who is friendly to their neighbor and wants good trading ties, and the U.S. gets involved. Thanks to a lot of very powerful people in the U.S. government, we can talk about later, and they tend to overthrow it. And so in February 2014, you had really the mother of all color revolutions. And I lived in Central Europe for quite a long time through the 1990s, and I watched the very early color revolutions that happened, and we watched them progress to be increasingly violent. And I would say the Maidan revolution was among the most violent that you'd see.
Yes.
And that was all, we know that was all precipitated by US because we have the tapes, right? We've seen the tapes, and we've seen the receipts. We've seen how much NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the USAID and others put into it. So that's when the war started. The war started when the United States overthrew a government that was democratically elected by all standards and imposed a government that was not democratically elected. And the people who had their vote stolen from them said, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem fair. I don't want to be a part of a country that steals my vote. And they decided to break away. So in a nutshell, that's what happened. And we're seeing now chapter 2 or 3 or 4 of that thing that was started by the US.
So when we listen to the mainstream media, obviously we are hearing the stories about Russian invasion, Putin is the new Hitler. How do you see the Russian role in all of this? And I would extend that further. How do you see the role of NATO in all of this?
Well, the one thing that I focus on is the pro-US foreign policy. So I refuse to take sides in what's happening there. But I do have an obligation to understand the motivations as a political analyst, the motivations behind what's happening. And so I understand, I try to look at if the shoe were on the other foot. And for example, Mexico, I live here in Texas. If Mexico had been overtaken, had been overthrown, and a government hostile to the US, or even take it further, California, hostile to the
Absolutely.
US and was lobbing missiles into Texas or New Mexico for 8 years, how would I see things? And it was backed by a foreign power, for example, by China.
Hmm.
Well, then you'd feel like there's a real threat here. There's an existential threat, and you'd be motivated to protect yourself against that. So I understand what's happening as why it's happening. Uh, but my main thing for our American audience is to say, listen, these guys in Washington are leading us down a path toward World War III over something that is absolutely unrelated to our national interest. Regardless of how you feel about Putin, you may feel that he is Hitler. It doesn't matter because it's not in our interest to go to nuclear war or any other kind of war with Russia over Ukraine's borders, which, by the way, have changed a lot over history, and
Yes.
over who rules Ukraine, because who cares at the end of the day?
So it is really not on our doorstep, which was the policy that a lot of us flocked to, the America First policy. How do we get back to that, where we are looking inward and taking care of our own rather than, or as you mentioned, taking care of our own borders rather than the borders of a foreign state?
That is difficult because the one issue, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, is the issue of propaganda and the manipulation of emotional responses to images, to false narratives. And you saw it in the US. I mean, you literally saw people who for 2 years had a mask on. They switched it over to a Ukraine flag. I mean, without
Yes.
missing a beat. I mean, these
Yes.
are the kinds of people that are easily manipulated. They watch the mainstream media. Even if they think they're watching independent media, they're not. And you have people that are experts. You have, our own CIA, our own deep state. They're experts at manipulating people's perceptions of things, and that's what you have to fight against. And it's very difficult. I will say, on a political realm, because I think you're also speaking in that way, and we talked about it in the Liberty Report
Mhm.
on Wednesday, is that a candidate for the U.S. Senate, J.D. Vance, over in Ohio,
Ohio.
he won his primary, and I'll say I'm not a voter, so I don't have a horse in the race at all. But I was
Sure.
pleased to see that he won his primary over very well financed opponents, all of
Mhm.
whom were in favor of no-fly zones. Vance was the only one that said, "No, we've got no business being over there. I don't want any part of it." And he's not perfect by any stretch, but that is a very good sign if we're looking for signs of how do we recover this America First foreign policy. Let's hope that's a little opening of the door.
Excellent. And we're certainly going to talk about that, but you mentioned so many different things that I would like to focus on. And the first one would be this concept of colored revolution and regime change. And obviously, yes, we have seen it in that eastern part of Europe, but as you mentioned, you lived in Central Europe, so you understand, particularly for our voters and our listeners, for American Serbs who have been part of this country since the 1800s, it was very difficult to watch the regime change and colored revolution that we would say was the blueprint for all colored revolutions that came later. But the 1990s, the breakup of Yugoslavia, sort of served as that initial blueprint for everything that came later. And now we see maybe the momentum and an opportunity to tell our story, because again, you brought up propaganda. Serbs were demonized, and only one side of the story came out during the 1990s. Particularly, there was no social media, so you
Yeah,
listened to CNN and Christiane Amanpour, for example, and that's all you knew.
yeah.
How do you reflect back to what happened in Yugoslavia and with the Serbs, which somehow were always central to a lot of these events, even today? How do you connect that to what's happening today?
Well, very much so. I mean, the overthrow of Milosevic in 2000 was this, I think, the beginning of the second phase, where the color revolutions became more violent. Through the 90s, they were mostly peaceful, as CNN might say, right? Mostly peaceful revolutions. But I was there for example, in Slovakia, and I was there in Croatia in the 90s, where the U.S. had a very particular view, and elsewhere. I was
Mhm.
monitoring elections with the British Helsinki Human Rights Group. And so we saw how they did it. We saw the formula. We also saw the precipitating factor. For example, in Slovakia, it was Vladimir Mečiar, who was
Mhm.
very much of a conservative populist, anti-communist. And that was the worst thing for the Americans. The Americans loved communists and post-communists. not real communists, not real old line brown polyester suited people, but no, the fancy ones that came over.
The transitioning ones.
Exactly, the Mercedes ones is the
Yes.
ones they like. And so when Mečiar refused to, for example, to privatize a steel plant in Košice to an American firm for a very, very low price, that's when his number came up and he was overthrown and destroyed and demonized. So on and on it goes. But you're right, the breakup of Yugoslavia was very, very important to American and German interests and European interests at the time. Divide and conquer was the thing. You know, I remember walking through Vukovar in it must have been 97,
Sure.
97, 98. And we talked to a lot of people, and it was really very depressing. But everyone I talked to, whether Serb or Croat, they said we never had any idea what our neighbor was. They were our neighbors. It didn't even come up until the wedges were driven, you know, by U.S. and European foreign policy.
And those wedges were somewhat easy to drive, given the World War I and World War II history of the region. It's very turbulent.
Yeah.
Every conquering power somehow had to go, obviously, through that area, and the aftermath we understand. I'd like to ask you about President Trump, and obviously we touched upon the America First policy. He certainly changed the trajectory of where we were supposedly headed when it comes to foreign policy. He was somewhat critical of NATO. He wanted to focus inward. He wanted to make sure that we are taking care of at home. And he understood that the billions and billions of dollars that were used to fight these foreign wars were in fact costing American taxpayers and American lives. But why couldn't he completely consolidate? In other words, what was the issue with where we started with President Trump and ultimately in 2020 where we are now?
Yeah, the Trump campaign versus the Trump presidency there is a real bifurcation there. And I think there are a number of factors. I think some of them are the limitations of the man. I mean, as much as there is to admire about Trump, and there's plenty to admire about Trump, ultimately, you could say he failed as a manager. He failed as a chief executive because he hired people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo to carry out a policy that they were diametrically opposed to. But I will say, having said that what is really incredible for me to see is how powerful, I think this is the one thing we take away from the Trump presidency, how powerful is the deep state? And it's not since the CIA assassination of John F. Kennedy that we see what happens to even a president of the United States who dares to threaten the deep state. And the deep state, for lack of a better term, it's a combination of course, the military-industrial complex, the think tank complex, the entrenched bureaucracy, the intelligence community, all of these, the permanent state of the U.S.
The permanent bureaucracy.
Yeah, which controls trillions of dollars. It's a rotating door of people through government and the so-called private sector, and it's all fed by war. And so when he just simply touched the edge of it, we all see what happened and how he got burned, and that's kind of a terrifying thing, I think.
It is terrifying, and that segues into a conversation I would like to have about the election integrity, what happened in 2020. Obviously, we're headed, you were just talking about the primary in Ohio, but we're headed into November. And obviously, we're hoping for the best. We're hoping that somehow we will consolidate, having understood the power of the deep state. However, the permanent bureaucracy, we understand it for what it is. And I think we understood it even further through the COVID pandemic, because, for example, you have Dr. Fauci's of the world, or even the Davos crowd, right? Who are complete, or European Union, the Brussels crowd, they are unelected bureaucrats. And to them, the election of a specific individual is almost like a temporary nuisance. They will come and go, but the permanent bureaucracy remains. So my question to you is, obviously, we have parallel governments. we can hope for the best in the election, but getting the best result means that we have to fight the deep state and get rid of the permanent bureaucracy. Is there hope to do that? And how do we do it?
Well, it's difficult because, I mean, I've lost all faith in our electoral system. And I think anyone who's paying attention has lost faith. Were so many anomalies. And I know there's cheating that goes on all the time, but there were so many anomalies in this last election. And we hear about something new every day. It's just like, it's how when there's a sensational story that comes out and there's a massive headline, oh, the ghost of Kiev, right? The ghost of Kiev for nothing, you see nothing more than 3 weeks. And then we just learned a couple of days ago, most of us already knew that the whole thing is fake. It's a phony. So we hear now a year into this ridiculous presidency of Biden, oh, well, gosh, look, here's a video of them stuffing votes. Here's a video of this or that. So we've got a real problem, and I spend a lot of time monitoring elections overseas. And ironically, the elections that were supposedly the worst, I noted that were the cleanest elections that I monitored. For example, Belarus in 2005 was probably one of the cleanest ones I've monitored. But this one, I mean, it has all the hallmarks, and I didn't see the details, but our election has all the hallmarks of one of the dirtiest elections you can ever imagine. How you go to bed with one number and you wake up in the morning with a whole new number, and et cetera, et cetera. Again, I don't have the details, but we've got a real problem here. And until we have serious electoral reform, I don't know how, even it doesn't matter who you vote for, right? It matters who counts the votes. And you mentioned
that just to stop you, I don't think we're trying to turn away the voters, obviously, from the process. But the question is, can we turn our country around via the democratic process?
Well, they're only trying to turn away the Republican voters, right?
Right.
They're not going to turn away the illegal alien voters, right? Oh, wait, hold on, my ballot is pre-marked. Oh, no, that's okay. You like Biden, don't you? I mean, I'm joking, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of corruption here, and I don't know exactly what the solution is. My friend Jeff Dice at the Mises Institute would argue that the problem is the stakes are too high. I mean, if you win a vote, you control all the goodies. You so much power, so much influence, so much money. So, and that's the argument for a more libertarian approach, which is if you shrink government, the consequences of elections are not as high, and so people aren't going to spend, $100 million to get a job that pays $170,000 a year.
Yes,
it's not like a very good investment to me.
And that even starts on the local level. And just to bring up, I'm here in Florida, in Naples, but even some of our school board elections, which is, again, it's a local, low level. But to your point, how much money is spent to enter some of these bureaucratic positions? They spent $300,000 on one particular school board race for a salary of maybe $35,000, $40,000. So I obviously, we imagine how high the stakes are. And even we're looking at Florida, for example, Governor DeSantis looking to reelect him. The Democrats are pouring billions of dollars into Florida right now to turn the state. And I'm sure the same is for Texas, because we seem to be the two states that don't want to play whatever the game it is that they're giving us.
Yeah, DeSantis is the big brother, and Abbott saw what would happen to him if he didn't follow the right lead. But look at all the attorneys general elections across the country. When you have someone like George Soros funding all of these crazed lunatics who get into office and let all the rapists out, and oh my gosh, he murdered a few people again. Who would have thought that would have happened? I mean, we've got a serious problem in the country.
Very serious problem. And I have to say, I am certainly terrified of where we are headed. But to sort of turn to the domestic policy and just overall the Biden presidency, how would you rate it so far?
It's unbelievable. It's one of the worst ever. I thought.
So who is in charge of our nation? Do we know?
That's the big question. I mean, is it the president's chief of staff? I think he's got a lot of power behind the scenes, and he likes it. Who is in charge? It's clearly not Biden. I mean, I have to confess, I do laugh when he says something stupid, which is literally every day. And that's the only value of this presidency. There's a huge comedic value of having Biden in office. But the problem is that the people that are behind him have a very strong agenda and it's diametrically opposed, certainly in foreign policy, and probably 99.9% in domestic policy
Mhm.
to the right thing for America.
To what the American people ultimately want.
Yeah, there's a small vocal minority that wants to turn this place into a Marxist hellhole, and they're doing a pretty good job of it.
You know, going back to you talking about propaganda, and certainly they're laying it very thick on any issue that we look at. But there was something that stayed with me after January 6th, and after obviously the election. And January 6th, Darren Beatty of Revolver News tweeted out 70+ million Americans are essentially now the Serbs of the 1990s. And that resonates with our voters. And I think that was the reason why the Serbs finally got together, and I was able to organize a movement, because we saw a little bit of light. We saw momentum. We saw the tide turning. And at this point, we obviously are questioning where it's going to go. But can you talk to me a little bit about what we saw during Trump's presidency in terms of Antifa and Black Lives Matter? And you said that the chip, it's almost like a chip that they switched from COVID to Ukraine. Well, now this leak out of the Supreme Court of the United States on the abortion issue, as far as I remember, unprecedented. These types of leaks don't happen. But obviously, this is a very specific point in our history, and it's a deliberate one. So are we now switching the chip again from COVID to Ukraine? Now it's Roe Wade issue.
Yeah.
How did this happen? And are we headed towards, again, a summer of protests and burnings and chaos on the streets? Are we consistently the empire of chaos?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I support the latest thing is the meme, you know.
The cause du jour.
Yeah, exactly. And it's getting faster and faster. 2 years of COVID, you know, 6 weeks of Ukraine, and now, you know, there's a fascinating political analyst. He actually lives in Kharkov, named Gonzalo Lira.
Yes, yes.
He had a great I don't know him. I don't know much about him other than he makes a lot of sense. But he had a great YouTube video. I think it was yesterday. And his theory, and it makes sense to me, although I don't know if he's right or wrong, his theory is that it's become very obvious to Washington that the propaganda coming out of the Ukraine war is completely false. That it's obvious that Russia's winning, and winning very, very quickly. And they're the need now, instead of taking the victory lap about these plucky Ukrainians and how we've supported their democracy, now they're desperately trying to switch the subject to something different. I think that makes sense from everything that I've seen. It's correct. You know, you have to dig very deep. You can't even, it's very deep. You have to dig to find out what's actually going on in Ukraine. But I think that's a valid argument. They're terrified. Then when the truth comes out about what happened in Ukraine, it's not at all going to be what they expected. Let's not forget, this is the same administration that made a disastrous evacuation of Afghanistan, right? So we're going to trust them to manage this one. They're going to do a good job on this one, right?
Well, what happened in Ukraine in 2014 essentially was under Obama-Biden administration. And we actually have the same array of characters right now back at this same issue, including Victoria Nuland, who was handing out muffins and pretzels during Maidan. She is back again. And there was an interesting exchange with Senator Marco Rubio and her about these biolabs in Ukraine. I mean, and Gonzalo Lira is an interesting character. He was missing, from what I understand, for several weeks. Now he's back. But do you think we're headed towards Russia-NATO direct confrontation? Obviously, this is a proxy war. And we've been fighting these proxy wars for a long time. But are we headed towards a hot war where we're certainly going to see something that's much more dangerous than where we're at now?
That's the thing, is we've been fighting proxy wars with third-rate powers. You know, now we're fighting one with the global nuclear superpower. And there's a real problem because, you know, I worked in Washington in foreign policy for a long time. The problem is it's a real echo chamber. Anyone with any different ideas or different thoughts, anyone like Gonzalo Lira, you know, or even Doug McGregor or Scott Ritter, people that are original thinkers who really digest a lot of material. And in the case of Colonel McGregor, who's literally a military expert. He's literally written books on military strategy, right?
Yes.
So he knows more than all of us. But when someone comes in that's outside this echo chamber, he's immediately an enemy, and the wagons circle, and he's kicked out. So there's a real danger of what the people that are making the decisions in Washington truly believe their rhetoric, truly believe their lies. And in fact, David Stockman, he was in Congress, and now he's a writer and an investor. He's on the board of our institute, but he wrote a great article, and it's on the Ron Paul Institute website today. And he talks about how basically, and this goes to your point about Trump, the 4 years of Trump derangement syndrome, which produced Russiagate, which we know was an absolute lie, proven to be a lie. What happened is all the Democrats, that became a religion. And so they believe it, and they believe it now. So and this is Stockman's theory. So in the absence of Trump, they have now transferred all that hatred of Trump toward Putin. And so they actually believe that by attacking Putin, they're avenging this 4-year nightmare of Trump. That is really dangerous. This is cult level stuff. And it's cult, it's like a kooky doomsday cult with nuclear weapons, right? This is not a good story. I don't like it.
And to your point, people who were sort of also eliminated for having a different idea and a different voice, I would actually think same thing happened to you. It happened to Congressman Paul, because we certainly remember him as one of those rare rational voices in Congress at the time, particularly even during the bombing of Yugoslavia and the regime change and Kosovo war. He was consistent, and his principles never changed to this day. But the echo chamber that you talk about, what is interesting is that on domestic policy, we can somehow see, whether it's fake or not, the difference between the conservatives and the liberals, for example, or Democrats and Republicans. But the moment we get into the foreign policy where there's a new war on the horizon, they all flock to the same side. And even, I hate to say, some representatives that we really like, that have been sensible throughout other issues like COVID. The moment President Trump left, as you said, they have immediately went back to the factory settings of warmongering.
Yeah, that's the case, unfortunately. And they think it sounds tough, but you mentioned something that I just want to follow up on, which is Dr. Paul's consistent position since the US war on Yugoslavia and Serbia. In fact, that's how I came to know that there was a person called Ron Paul, because I was living in Budapest. I had spent a lot of time. I'd been to Serbia before a couple of times. I'd spent a lot of time in the Balkans, and I saw the war on the horizon. I saw what was going to happen as we moved into 1999, and I was absolutely horrified about what I knew Clinton was going to do to Serbia. And I kept reading. There's this one congressman who really gets it. Because I was on the ground, I knew what was going to happen. I knew what a nightmare it was. And that's how I discovered there's this great person called Ron Paul. And there's this great website called antiwar.com that was featuring Ron Paul's articles. And I met some great people like Jim Jatras, you may have heard of, and others. Who
served on my doctoral dissertation.
Oh, did he? Oh,
yes.
Jim's one of my oldest friends. So.
Oh, wonderful.
So anyway, that's how I got to know Dr. Paul, and that's how I understood that non-interventionism is the best policy, going on. And so I was fortunate to work for him just by a bit of good luck. But
and we were all fortunate to learn from both of you and to follow what you consistently stood for. But as you said, the circle of people who really get it and who understand what non-interventionism means are consistently pushed away from the mainstream and marginalized, where even today you really cannot hear in the mainstream media a rational and a responsible voice, particularly in foreign policy, which for me, I've been in that arena for many, many years, and that is my expertise. What American people sometimes tend to forget is that our foreign policy directly affects what is happening in their backyard, what is happening at the grocery store, what is happening at the gas pump, even today. I mean, we're at almost $5 a gallon for gas. We have less and less food in the grocery stores. So even that, throughout this Biden presidency, we're headed for a disaster that is very visible now for all of us. I want to just bring up something else, and maybe you have more information on it than I do. Going back to Ukraine and Russia and this whole Russia dossier during President Trump, even impeachment trial, many forget that Ukraine somehow played a central role even in this fiasco. Do you know much about it?
I know a bit about it. I mean, I know certainly the role of people like Colonel Vindman, who was probably a plant in the White House to try to gin up the impeachment ultimately. But if you have something more in mind, I'm happy to hear it. See if it's what I was thinking.
Through the dossier and through some of these internal investigations, we have found out that in fact the elements that lobby from the Ukrainian side were directly involved in this coup against President Trump, and on top of that, Antifa trains in Ukraine.
No, I didn't know that. Interesting.
These are the things that I know, and maybe after this we can talk more about it. But knowing that, for example, Saudi lobby or Israeli lobby are some of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, in the past several years, Ukrainian lobby has overpassed both of those.
And
so
they do it with American money. You know, I think it was Max Blumenthal that had a great piece about how many, I think they hired 150 PR firms in Washington to push their line. And
exactly.
Where do they get that
so
money?
Back to your point about USAID and even open and National Endowment for Democracy, and then Soros organizations, the trillions of dollars that we're even sending now, they somehow circle back to these special interests.
Yeah, and it's all made possible by the Federal Reserve, right? They print the money and it goes round and round and round. So.
And talking about the Federal Reserve and hitting on the issue of our petrodollar, is this the fight that we're witnessing right now with, and what is it that we're trying to defend in Ukraine?
Yeah, it seems like an own goal, this whole thing does. And certainly the Europeans are shooting themselves in the head over this, with the exception maybe of Hungary, which is everyone hates, right?
Yes.
After Putin, Orban is the worst person on earth for not wanting to destroy his country in the name of Ukraine. But there was an excellent piece in The Hill of all places, right? Mainstream publication, and it said something like, you probably saw it. The headline was, "The sanctions on Russia might not be working," And you look down, it was like the fourth paragraph, and it said they've actually made double the oil revenue that they made before this whole thing happened.
Exactly, so they're making a lot of money. Meanwhile, we are losing.
Yeah.
And
the Germans can't even take a shower now, right? Yeah. They said, don't take a shower.
That's exactly right. So Europeans certainly are bearing a big brunt of this, but I feel we are going to soon enough. We already are, but it seems like we're headed for more of a disaster. But to your point about Viktor Orban, well, Serbia obviously is not within the European Union. It's not a member, and it maintains its neutrality status, even in terms of NATO. And the Serbs really are not even that pro-Russia. How against NATO they are, obviously, because of 1999 and the bombing. But Serbia is the only country in Europe that actually hasn't imposed sanctions on Russia. So we're there on par with Viktor Orban.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting dynamic, obviously.
And probably if some of those elections in Serbia hadn't been so manipulated, you probably have a Viktor Orban in power right now. You never know.
Right. Well, I want to touch upon one final thing, and that would be, where is our Vice President, Kamala Harris? And is it possible that something disastrous will certainly come out of Ukraine? Because we understand that there's a story about the Biden laptop, and we have known about Burisma and a lot of these shady dealings in Ukraine ever since 2014 and beyond. Do you think that something disastrous will happen with the Biden presidency? And do you see the prospect of Kamala Harris maybe being at the helm of our nation?
Well, I would think if we didn't have the Republican leadership in the House and Senate that we have, things could actually get interesting. But there's no way that someone like McConnell is going to upset the apple cart. I mean, but if you just imagine if you had the Republicans take over the House and Senate and start launching some serious investigations and really opening the books on what happened, you could really see. I mean, it would be popcorn time, I think. But you have McCarthy and McConnell, who are creatures of the deep state themselves. So I don't have a lot of optimism about it. But still, you could see something like that happen and start really looking into, why is he called the big guy? What's he getting this 10% for? What's this all about? This doesn't sound kosher to me.
Right.
So it could get interesting. But where is Kamala Harris? I mean, can you imagine if she were in charge? She has distinguished herself as being one of the least in tune, one of the least articulate, one of the least likable political figures, I think, in modern American history. Ever. I mean, every time she opens her mouth, it's a start. In fact, there is an entertainment value to listening to her that's similar to listening to Biden, because it's just so kooky.
Prediction for 2024.
2024.
It sounds so far, but here we are in 22, and November is around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, Ron DeSantis is a younger and more vibrant Trump. And if I were Trump, I would be looking behind myself at the shadow of Ron DeSantis. And there are things I like about DeSantis. I find DeSantis much more of a hawk than Trump.
Okay.
Certainly his foreign policy is a lot more aggressive than Trump's. So if I were Trump, I'd be worried about that. Is there someone else on the horizon? What I would love to see, this is my personal view, is a return of the populist old right. I mean, I was a big Buchanan supporter. I would love to see a Pat Buchanan type who's pro-worker, who's pro-blue collar. And Trump did a good job with that. He connected with working Americans. The Democrats hate working Americans. They're all a bunch of, white supremacists or whatever.
Yes, they have become the ivory tower elitists.
Exactly. So you need a good populist Republican who embraces working America, who understands the importance of returning manufacturing without being a China basher, because that's not the solution. There's got to be a different way of doing that, and understands what Trump said about NATO and about US troops in Europe and why are we doing this. I would like to see the emergence of someone like that. I wish Trump were that guy. I like Trump, but he sure has let a lot of us down a lot. So we'll see what happens.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Anything else that I may have missed and you would like to tell some of our Serbian listeners and Serbian voters?
Well, I just would like, if they would like to tune into the Liberty Report, we are on YouTube, at least for now, until we're canceled. We have a lot of conferences. In fact, we've had Jim Jatra speak at our conferences. We've had Colonel McGregor speak twice at our conferences. So ronpaulinstitute.org is our website if you want to follow what we do. And I love Serbs. I love to meet Serbs. So we'd love to see you at some of our future events.
Excellent. We would love that. And as I said, Congressman Ron Paul was somebody who inspired many of us. And I am sure we can do some great things together in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks.